I'm going to talk about talking and how institutions take part in difficult dialogue, and you'll see what I mean in a second. At our opening school meeting, and some of you may have heard about it or maybe seen it online, I proposed a metaphor that we could use in thinking about how a school inevitably found itself having complex and charged conversations about issues. And I was thinking about how tables throughout human history have said something powerful about the way we gather as people. And I was thinking actually about a very specific table, and that was the one that Horace Taft sat at in 1890 on the first evening of the school's existence. And he never forgot that table, and why not? It was where it all began, and in his 1942 memoir he wrote, 14 of us sat down at the table that night. That table we still have, and it is our only relic of our Pelham Manor days. And so the table mattered, you can tell. And notice that declarative, right? The table we still have. I think it had a kind of sacred quality to it, hence the noun relic. As far as I know, though, that table is lost to time. And as someone who loves symbols, I lament the loss. The table seems to me a perpetual reminder, and here's the metaphor I've introduced for the school, of what a community is trying to be. That is, teachers and students gathering around a kind of shared purpose, speaking and listening to one another, provoking and challenging, perpetually learning and growing. And so I think about how that image of Taft at his school, at that table that first night, can speak to our work today in the most difficult of conversations. And this is a topic I think institutions seem a little bit unwilling to talk about explicitly. I think we do well to bring it out into the air and the light. And the discussions I'm talking about, of course, are the ones that our nation is having on race and class and policing and gender, privilege, immigration, and so on. There is not a college in the country, and this you know, which is not wrestling with the issues. And so too have all secondary schools, by the way, public and private. We surely have here at Taft, in our own, I think, imperfect and brave and optimistic way. These are issues your students, your children want to talk about, and we should honor that impulse, even as we may, as adults, feel somewhat exhausted and maybe even dispirited by the national dialogue. So today I'm just going to suggest this, that it's inevitable and right that we explicitly discuss these issues, that the challenges in doing so are profound, that there are ways we can think about the discussion that can make it more productive, and if we get it right, or even close to right, maybe that table can still exist. So let me start with this question. I am guessing that somebody could argue or ask essentially this. Look, you're an academic institution. Why don't you just stick to algebra and literature, chemistry, Spanish, and history? Wouldn't life be easier if you didn't have all those messy discussions that the nation's having? And my answer is, well, sure. Life would be a lot easier. But our school would be a lot less interesting, and it would soon be irrelevant. No school that's interested in developing citizens and leaders can decline the participation in this discussion on these great and thorny issues. Taft students, after all, have always brought fierce and impassioned perspectives on political and cultural issues. It's always been thus. Pick up a papyrus from any decade in our history, you will see evidence of that. Pick up the papyrus today, of course, and you'll see it. And as well, remember, your children exist and live in such a thoroughly and deeply and pervasively connected existence that even to contemplate a place where they were isolated from events and issues of the world is impossible, right? The train of connectivity left long ago, and they are on it. And then finally, remember that our goal is to create a community of diverse perspective and experiences. That is, our philosophy guarantees that when we open our doors in September, the issues of the world will walk right through them. Really simply, we created the problem, if you want to call it that. And I guess in theory, we could have a different enrollment philosophy and really seek to find uncurious and disengaged students who had similar experiences, but I wouldn't want to teach at that school. So like it or not, and for the record, I like it, these issues are here and they are not going to go away. I think the more interesting question is, what are the reasons that you could argue that Taft is morally and educationally obligated to engage in these very conversations that are so challenging? The argument, you know, of course, is that the skills of democratic citizenship depend on this kind of education. You could call this the Founding Fathers argument, the claim that an informed and educated populace was vital to ensuring and enduring democracy. I can quote Thomas Jefferson, but I could quote any other of the Founding Fathers as well, who Jefferson wrote, "Educate and inform the whole mass of people. They are the only sure reliance on the preservation of liberty." And of course, scores of voices have followed. Some of you know them. We think of Dewey, of course, thinking about democracy and education. I think of a contemporary writer, a man named Thomas Lacona, in a work, Educating for Character, How Our Schools Teach Respect and Responsibility. And he writes as if he is on our campus. And I know there's a few students in the audience, this may resonate with them. He writes this: "Since controversy is a fact of life, it is artificial and poor preparation for citizenship for schools to try to avoid all controversial issues. How can we hope to develop citizens capable of making reasoned arguments about the difficult moral questions of our day if students never learn to think critically about those complex issues?" It's a widely accepted argument that schools like Taft, in offering the opportunity for informed debate and clashing perspectives, provides the opportunity and the preparation needed for citizenship. There's an imperative, not a choice. Our students must think critically about the socio-political issues of the day, and they must develop and practice the skills for engaged citizenry and effective leadership if our democracy is to thrive. So far, it seems to me easy. We can't avoid tackling the issues. We have an obligation to wrestle them. What's harder is when you ask this question: what are the challenges that come with trying to engage as an institution in these very difficult issues? And I'm going to list some of the challenges, and by the end of it, you may end up saying, you'll never be able to do this. Why would you even try? Think of the challenges. The first, as I mentioned, is the most important one. We're an incredibly diverse school, and we believe that a diverse learning community is a much more interesting one than a homogeneous one, because there will be profound disagreement and clashing perspectives. So if you set out to create a community like this, you have made your work very hard. I would add this: we are a profoundly human organization. Faculty and students are imperfect. We have bad days. Like many of you, we teachers are debating internally, or in our marriages, or in our larger families, or with our friends on the very issues we try to guide students on. And it's not always easy to leave your own personal luggage at the home, especially if, well, we never leave home. Helping teenagers with wildly different views engage in a dialogue, let's say on race or immigration, is a lot harder than teaching where the comma should go after that introductory dependent clause. And that's just the faculty. Remember, we're also talking about teenagers. Granted, they're yours. They're bright, they're impassioned, they're smart. But these are issues that adult students in college wrestle with. The teenagers on this campus I find incredibly impressive, but they carry all the to-be-expected baggage that comes with adolescence. They struggle every day to understand themselves. They've got really complicated and layered social lives, and their cognitive and communication skills are still developing. So this kind of cultural dialogue is not easy. Another challenge is this one. We are educating a generation of students for whom much interaction takes place on social media, and where the expectations of civil engagement, I think, have all been lost. So a lot of personal conversations actually begin first with the undoing of damage that may have been created in the online dialogue. That may sound familiar to you. Adolescents today spend a lot less time in personal debate and discussion and conflict resolution than you did, and they're still learning how to do that. Another challenge is time. Difficult conversations take a lot of time and effort and planning and executing. We never have enough time on this campus. Another is we are a very close community, and we have little escape from each other. You don't have to volunteer, but if you've ever had one of those big family blow-ups in the home with raised voices and sulky silence and slammed doors and tense goodbyes in the morning, that's easy. You can hole up in the bedroom or skip the family dinner or get in the car the next day to go to school or work, and not here. We live with each other 24/7, and we never get to say we're not going to participate. And then finally, the last challenge is one every one of you is intensely aware of, and that is If this generation is looking to national figures for the models of what a constructive, civil, and engaged discussion on pressing and heavy issues looks like, they will find, well, frankly, a conversation that is too often exactly the opposite. So there are many challenges in doing this, and I think we should recognize those, that constructing a productive and constructive discussion about these kind of issues is very difficult. We are a human organization of diverse perspectives, with limited time, entwined in relationships in a community we never leave, and with few models of public excellence. So again, you might be thinking, how do you possibly do it, and can it even happen? You can guess my answer. My answer is, of course it can. What we do, what we seek to do, I think both bravely and imperfectly, is to live out that metaphor of the table, a place where diverse people gather around a shared purpose, where students and faculty speak and listen equally with empathy and rigor, where they are challenged by ideas that may be new and even discomforting, and where they deepen their understanding of each other and broaden and deepen their leadership skills. And I found two authors I find who are particularly helpful in thinking, how do you create that table? The first is someone who's written about the ancient art of rhetoric, and the second who's authored a book more about the corporate ways in which we conduct difficult conversations. I'm really interested in how we can borrow from their thinking. So the first is this work by a woman named Sharon Crowley. It's a work called Towards a Civil Discourse, and it offers a fascinating argument. She's a Arizona State University English professor. And she argues that the ancient art of rhetoric, that is the skill of finding persuasion, which was taught throughout Western history, from the Greeks and Romans to the classrooms of Harvard at the turn of the 19th century, that rhetoric can provide great models for us. Rhetoric was a curricular taught skill. By our generations, it was no longer. It fell out of favor by the 19th century. But for many students in Western civilization, this is what they were trained in. Students were formally trained in rhetoric classes, in the planning of an argument and selected evidence, in the consideration of an audience, in recognizing opposing points of view, and in the goal of persuasion. And some of the great debates in our own history, independence, women's suffrage, abolition, workers' rights, these were shaped by skilled practitioners in rhetoric. Properly exercised, she writes, rhetoric allows those who are familiar with its concepts and vocabulary to intervene fruitfully in disputes and disagreements. Positions are changed. Ideas are modified. Often agreement is uncovered. Debate, she argues, in this way is productive. To engage in rhetorical discussion obligates you to work very hard, to be willing to submit your claims to inquiry and dispute, to respect and encounter opposition, and perhaps risk having your own mind changed. This address itself is an act of rhetoric, of course. Here's how she puts it, and I think I could laminate this in a way and scatter these cards around campus. She writes, rhetorical argument entails the exchange of claims and evidence about a disputed position. It requires an advocate to recognize that an opponent has a position on hand, and it requires a willingness to be addressed by others. This is to say, rhetorical argument requires an advocate to acknowledge that his or her claims are controversial. And it's a beautiful passage. It's a lot for our students here. It's how Aristotle helped his students manage disputes. It's how the Declaration of Independence was constructed. It's how Lincoln penned the Gettysburg Address, and those seems to me pretty good endorsements. There is mutual exchange, a recognition your view may be disputed. There's a consideration of appropriate evidence, and there's a willingness to be addressed. And to be clear, rhetoric is not about making disagreements disappear. She writes, rhetoric cannot thrive where open disagreement is discouraged. Rhetoric is about finding means of persuasion. She argues, understood properly, rhetoric can take us away from the winner or loser paradigm of an argument. She writes, persuasion is often thought of in a very narrow sense to mean convincing someone that her position is wrong or that someone else's is right. Ideally, however, all parties to an argument risk alteration of their position as the argument proceeds, and so it's hard to know what winning or losing might mean. Now, we don't formally teach rhetoric the way the ancient Greeks did, or even the professor in Oxford or Berlin or Cambridge did in 1900. But the fundamental tenets, I think, are available and they are applicable. And your children are developing those skills in and out of the classroom, and I think we can explicitly use them to guide our work in these difficult conversations. And that brings me to the second book, which is entitled, yes, Difficult Conversations. It's more of a corporate guidebook, but it's nonetheless spot on for our work, and it provides tremendously helpful ideas. In some ways, I think the authors, despite writing for the private sector, they seem to understand what productive dialogue among teenagers can look like. And listen carefully to what they say as a starting point for these conversations. And think particularly of your sons and daughters. Think exactly of the experience they have. Here's how they begin. And think of this, let's say, in a conversation on race or privilege or policing or what have you. They write, "Anytime we feel vulnerable or our self-esteem is implicated, when the issues at stake are important and the outcome is uncertain, when we care deeply about what is being discussed or about the people with whom we are discussing it, there is potential to experience that conversation as extraordinarily difficult." Every clause in that speaks to what our students are going through. Teenagers who feel some vulnerability, topics which can be intensely personal, participants with whom they have strong and complicated relationships. I think recognizing that is a really good place to begin. They next argue, you've got to set realistic goals. Eliminating fear and anxiety will never happen, they say, but reducing them and learning how to manage that which remains are more obtainable. Achieving perfect results with no risk will not happen. Getting better results in the face of tolerable odds might. It's a really helpful notion that we must manage our expectations of difficult conversations, and that fear and anxiety are a given for all of us. And then they suggest that we should see these difficult conversations really as a sharing of stories which result from different information. Difficult conversations, they write, and by the way, I shared this passage with some student leaders, and they said this is exactly what's happening with all of us. Difficult conversations arise precisely at those moments where important parts of our story collide with another person's story. We assume the collision is because of how the other person is. They assume it's because of how we are. But really the collision is the result of our stories simply being different with neither of us realizing it. We have different stories about the world because we take in different information and we interpret information in our own unique ways. Too often, we trade only in conclusions without stepping down to where the real action is, the information and the interpretation that lead us each to see the world as we do. Certainty, they argue, locks us out. Curiosity lets us in. They offer a really helpful way of thinking about these tough conversations that we are always having. Start by recognizing how difficult the conditions are. Acknowledge the anxiety we all bring. Manage the expectations and try to understand the stories we do. So the authors of these two works, one's from the lens of the art of rhetoric and one from the corporate setting, I think offer a lot of help for us. They do not suggest that this is easy. They never have claimed that you won't be unsettled or discomforted or challenged. Students will be. That's where learning occurs. These conversations, I think, properly understood, should be seen as an extension, not an exception, to the kind of discourse that happens in classes, where your insights may be challenged, where you will have to explain yourself, where you will have to listen to claims with which you disagree. Argued this, or viewed this way, we do what Laconin notes. Handled well, ethical debates about complex topics can teach students to study an issue in depth, develop reasoned arguments for a position, articulate those arguments in a public forum, and listen and respond to opposing views. You've seen enough on the college campuses and in the halls of politics to recognize how difficult this is for people and organizations to engage with the kind of wisdom of the great rhetoricians or with the awareness that's described in difficult conversations. But I will tell you, I remain stubbornly optimistic, in part because I think there's an insistence on this campus that we try to do this well, in part because of the quality of faculty, and probably most of all because your children are smart and eager and compassionate, and they want to be in these conversations. Moorhead Academic Center director and the former academic dean, someone you all know, John Wilson, feels the same way. I think he has the same optimism, and he even gives a historical perspective. He wrote this to me in an email. Civil discourse and compromise, even among those with comparable backgrounds and upbringings, has always been hard. Just ask the framers of the Constitution. So what we and other institutions of learning are trying to negotiate is remarkably challenging. Informed, face-to-face conversations, individual, small group gatherings, larger groups, these are the only ways to address these complexities. And I have to think that Taft's culture of caring puts us in a good position to address them. Here's what it looks like, I think, at our best. And I will tell you that we are not perfect at this. But at our best, it looks like this. It's the papyrus, even the one you've just picked up, and a collection of columns and editorials which are informed and reasoned and provocative. It's a senior girl who, after a painfully charged meeting, sent a brave email to the community saying, and I quote in part, "I realize how difficult it may be to truly grasp the experiences or different perspective of others. I struggle with this. I encourage anyone who would like to understand more about how I feel as a person of color at Taft to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to sit down and have a conversation where we discuss and listen to each other." And it's a conversation that followed over lunch. 3 sharp, respectful, opinionated students talking, listening, disagreeing, persuading, sharing stories. It's a school meeting last week on national incarceration policies with 3 outside speakers, including current parent Neil O'Leary, the mayor of Waterbury, who has 3 decades of law enforcement experience, and 2 national level leaders in prison reform, all of them modeling for the school in front of them what a reasoned debate and discussion can look like. It's a new student journal, the ultra-crepidarian, a self-mocking term which means someone who, quote, who offers judgment or criticism without the expertise to do so, and whose mission is to encourage and strengthen political and intellectual engagement at Taft. Specifically, we are committed to the nonpartisan distribution of articles and editorials which will both elevate and enhance the quality of discussion and debate through high-quality, well-researched pieces that exhibit a percipient and civil voice. I might contrast, by the way, the mission of those teenagers in our national dialogue. It's a girl standing in front of assembly thanking 2 boys whose backgrounds and views were very different than hers for their participation and thoughtfulness in a student-run meeting on race. It's a fishbowl exercise we'll do next week with 11 seniors talking about race and privilege in front of lower mids and new mids, hopefully modeling for them what constructive and robust, respectful dialogue and debate can look like. It's my living room last week in front of the fire with Mr. LaCase and Miss Koshy and a dozen school monitors in pairs, all discussing excerpts from difficult conversations, and a boy saying, "Isn't this about how you try to create a culture of rigorous open-mindedness?" I said, yes, yes. So we can't fear or avoid these conversations. In fact, our students want and need them, and we have to provide and shape them no matter how challenging. I think the table metaphor is perfectly suited for us with its implications of fellowship and debate and listening and learning. But to be clear, it's not the table that Horace Taft sat at in 1890 with a dozen white boys from New England in a small house in the suburbs for whom news came when it did with the occasional Sunday paper and for whom communication was a weekly letter. Our work today is infinitely more challenging and complex. Our table much larger and more boisterous. The world far more intrusive and partisan. The issues more potent and even explosive. It is tough and it is exhausting work. But I add, it's also exhilarating and it is filled with power and potential. And it is hungered for. Your children want to talk. They want to understand the world we've given them. They want to improve it. They dream the way we once did. If we can meet those challenges bravely and conduct a civil discourse that our college campuses struggle to find and our nation seems unable to achieve, if we can help your children develop the skills of informed citizenship and principled leadership, then we might be doing something rare and perhaps seen through our adult eyes, which I think are cataracted with doubt and blurred by fatigue, something beautiful and maybe even redemptive. Maybe we will have found that table that was lost to time. And so it's in that spirit and with the sense that every day at Taft, we're simply trying to recreate that table that we lost. I welcome you. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I thank you all for everything you do for Taft. Thank you.